I'm a hair mineral analysis expert. I have a background in functional medicine, and I educate people using HTMA testing to maximize health, erase debilitating symptoms, and gain energy. I'm a multi-time kettlebell sport world champion, and I'm constantly searching for high-performance pros from all over the world to bring you this human optimization podcast. My name is Lisa Pitel-Killah. Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Human Optimization Podcast. And I'm so excited to have Jason Earle here with us today. He is a man on a mission, an adoring father, an incurable entrepreneur, and an indoor air quality crusader. He is the founder and CEO of 1-800-GOT-MOLD and Makeover USA, and the creator of the Got Mold test kit, which we're going to dive into today. Over the last 20 years, Jason has performed countless sick building investigations, solving many medical mysteries along the way and helping thousands of families recover their health and peace of mind. He's been featured or appeared on Good Morning America, Extreme Makeover Home Editions, The Dr. Oz Show, Entrepreneur, Wired, and at least 2 college textbooks, and a lot more. So welcome to the show, Jason.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's great to be here.
So happy to have you. And so you have an amazing story of how this all came to be and a Guinness World Record, right? Guinness Book World Record. You have to tell us all about that because I know everybody's dying. I was just floored when I read your bio and your story. It's so interesting.
Well, thank you for saying so. You look back at these things and it all makes sense in retrospect. I still sometimes look back at that and think, wow, that happened to me. But at the time, those things were really a byproduct of a lot of challenge and a lot of adversity. So, it's easy to make sense of stuff in retrospect, and but when you're in the moment, that's a whole different conversation. So, first of all, thanks again for having me. I'm very excited about the show. I listened to a bunch of your podcasts, and I very much enjoyed it. I like your background and story. I feel like sometimes I should be interviewing the people that are interviewing me, and you're one of those. It's sometimes best to just start at the beginning. So I grew up on a small sort of hobby farm, non-working farm down in a town outside of Princeton, New Jersey. So central New Jersey. And we rescued animals of, various sorts and kinds, horses and goats and all that kind of stuff. And it was really idyllic in many ways. What wasn't so idyllic was the general hygiene around the house and some of the, maintenance issues and the family dynamic. I grew up in a very alcoholic family, generationally alcoholic on both sides. And there was just a lot of mental illness, and but I spent a lot of time outside, and I really enjoyed. I look back at my childhood with a lot of warm feelings.
Mm-hmm.
But around the age of 4 years old, I suddenly developed difficulty breathing, and I fell ill. I lost a bunch of weight in a 3-week period. My mom was a nurse, and so she was very concerned, and they took me to the pediatrician, who said, "You need to take him to the hospital." At the hospital, they said, it was Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who's renowned for their respiratory work. They said, based upon family history and the symptoms, they suspected that I had cystic fibrosis, which was devastating to my parents. My dad in particular, because he had lost 4 of his cousins to CF before the age of 14.
Oh my gosh.
So they spent the next 6 weeks crying while they waited for the second opinion, which they were gratified to learn that I didn't have CF. Actually, I had asthma compounded by pneumonia. And when they tested my skin for allergies, back then it was, I think, a little medieval. They probably don't do it any differently now. But it was a little bit of it was like a toddler straitjacket, and then they with an open back, and then they do this skin test. And my dad said I looked like a ladybug, just big red swollen back with dots all over it. It was just So all the things they tested me for, I tested positive for, every single thing. So they said it was grass, wheat, just off the top. This is like the ones that I remember off the top of my head: grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton, soybeans. And I grew up on a little, like I said, a little farm surrounded by all those things and then some, right? In fact, soybeans, we had fields of soybeans around me and fields of corn, and and so it was I was awash in the very things that were challenging me. every single day. And so I lived on inhalers, and just kind of didn't. I actually forgot about it. Most of my childhood, I didn't even. I mean, it was difficult, but it was such a normal thing for me, right? And then around the time I was 12 years old, my folks split up, which was a benefit to everybody involved. And so I moved out of that house, that little farmhouse, and all my symptoms went away. Not immediately, but in a fairly short period of time, I had a lot of relief, and it was chalked up at the time to me growing out of asthma, as my grandfather had when he was adolescent, and which is very common. Most cases resolve actually in adolescence, but in my case, there was a lot of other stuff going on that I was also kind of distracted. About a year after my folks split up, my mom committed suicide, and it was several attempts in, so it was not really a surprise to anyone. And that one experience changed my life for the better in so many ways. Not because I lost my mom, but because of the insights that I gained from that. The idea that you don't really appreciate life until it's taken from you or until it's threatened. And so at a very young age, I was presented with these questions about whose life is it? What is life? What would cause someone to make those decisions? In particular, what I realized was she had lost perspective on the magic of the universe, and she had lost it a long time before that. And that was my essential takeaway. And I have since that point in my life become obsessed with the magic of the universe. And in fact, I was such a depressed adolescent. I had there was a lot going on. I was really a difficult teenager. I've got two little boys. I hope karma doesn't pull this one full circle, but I that transformed me, and from that point forward, I became strangely a devout optimist. And anyway, so then right after that, I got diagnosed with Lyme disease, and it was loaded up on antibiotics. That was the second big dose of antibiotics. The first one was when I had pneumonia, and I missed a ton of school, and such that they actually asked me to consider coming back to repeat my junior year while I was halfway through. And I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. I think I'll probably sign. So I convinced my father to sign me out under the promise that I would go to the gas station and save money. And I told him I would get my GED and start college a year early. That was my plan. I was just there's no better revenge than massive success. And I figured, I'll leapfrog them instead of getting held back. And so he was inspired by that and endorsed it. And so I was working full time at the gas station when a guy came in with a flat tire who, it's a long story for maybe another podcast, but he came in with a flat tire and I repaired it quickly, and he gave me a big tip. And it was a $50 bill instead of a $5 repair. I told him at the time, $5, and he slapped some money in my hand, drove away. And I saw him again 2 weeks later and approached him and said, hey, listen, I don't know if you realize you gave me a $50 bill for a $5 repair, but because I actually thought it was a mistake. I honestly thought he was going to come back because I thought it was a mistake. And that's how small-minded I was at 16. And when I told him that I was surprised by the tip, he said the only reason I gave you a 50 was because I didn't have 100. It was like, I was late and you did a great job, and and I said, well, I feel like I owe you a favor or something. He's like, kid, you don't get it. If anything, I owe you a favor. And I said, well, how about getting me a job? I said, what do you do for a living? And he said, I work on Wall Street. And I said, how about getting me a job? And he said, well, you only get in life what you ask for. And so write down my number and call me by 9 a.m. tomorrow, or don't ever bother calling me at all. Yeah. So I grabbed the pen and started writing on my hand, and he started laughing, and he rolled up his sleeves and showed me his stock quotes written all over his forearm. So he goes, kid, you're going to fit right in. So, and the next morning I called him. I had a hard time getting up in the morning at the time for lots of different reasons. I was still dealing with a lot of fatigue, difficulty, brain fog from Lyme disease. Not so much I think it was mostly from the dysbiosis and the fermenting that was happening in my gut from the eating simple carbohydrates and having wiped out all my flora. So I was really dealing with a lot of that kind of just complete cognitive fog. But I did manage to call him at 8:59 in the morning, and he answered with surprise and said, "Kid, you called." And I said, "Of course I did." And he said, "No, kid, you don't get it. Most people don't call; they don't show up." He's like, "So what are you doing today?" And I said, "I'm going to work." And he said, "Where?" And I said, "The gas station." He goes, "Wrong answer." And so, can we do that again? And he's like, sure. What are you doing today? I said, I'm going to work. He said, where? And I said, what's your address? And he goes, 88 Pine Street, 10th floor. See you. And he hangs up on me. And I was like, what is going on? Like, I don't have a suit. I have nothing. I have no idea. What am I doing? I have no idea where I'm going. You know, I'm like 16 years old. I'm a high school dropout. I literally have no idea what's going on. And so I borrowed a sweater and a button-down shirt from my dad. And I put on my finest pair of jeans that didn't have oil smears on them. And put on some penny loafers and flip over that were too big. I literally stuffed tissues into the toes and flip flop my way up to. I lived. It was an hour train ride. You know, that was how he was commuting. He was commuting to the train station so that's how we. Yeah. And anyway, I showed up, and he's like, "You showed up." And again, he was so surprised by this. And it wasn't until years later, after I tried to recruit kids to come become a stockbroker, that I realized that they don't show up, they don't call. You know, exactly. So his surprise was well founded. So anyway, it turns out he was the managing director of a firm that was in the boiler room days. It was very similar to the Wolf of Wall Street guys. It was exactly the same era, same time actually. I was very well aware of Jordan Belfort and all of his shenanigans at the time. Yeah. But these guys were doing their own shenanigans, and I worked there for about a year before I realized, wow, this is not the way Wall Street's supposed to be. These guys are really crazy and they're doing bad stuff. And so I was able to get out. But right before I got out, I got my stockbroker's license. I was able to get my license, and I unknowingly at the time I just turned 17. Actually, I was later in the year. But anyway, the bottom line is I ended up unknowingly becoming the youngest licensed stockbroker in history. And it was such a surprise to everybody that my family didn't even believe me. My grandmother thought that I was lying for years up until right before she died. She thought I was a fraud. She thought I was working on Wall Street, but she thought I was a janitor, or that she seriously thought that I had like somehow manipulated that I was working on Wall Street, as in like that's the yeah. So anyway, while I did that for 9 years. And I had a really nice career. I mean, I had a lot of fun. I owned a firm for 2 years at the end, right before the dot-com bubble burst. And at 25 years old, and I was just, I kind of felt like, but I had a real problem. And the real problem was, I had developed a drinking problem, which is, of course, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Yeah. But I had plenty of reasons not to drink, such that I quit drinking when I was 13. That's how much I had already learned from that. But then, so that's a longer story for probably another podcast too. But I was also self-medicating on that because there was also a lot of lingering stuff going on from some of my health issues. Yeah. And so it all makes sense in retrospect. But the thing that made me leave Wall Street was that I had this voice of my mom's in my head, as many of us do have our parents' voices. Mm-hmm. But this voice was a productive one, and she always said to me, if you find a way to improve the quality of other people's lives, it will improve the quality of your life. It's a natural law, contribution to the greater good. And she had me volunteer at the hospital where she worked when I was a kid during the summers. And mostly to keep me from burning the house down, but also to help embed these values into my life. And when I was a stockbroker, I would do some international missions with Operation Smile, and I found that to be the most satisfying part of my life. And yet, it was just the smallest part of my life. Yeah. And so when the dot-com bubble burst and everything hit the fan, I lost most of the money I'd made, and I was also looking for a big change. And my substance abuses were accelerating, and I just knew it was time for me to make a big change. And so I went on walkabout. I sold everything and I went traveling. Mm-hmm. And while I was in Hawaii, I took a train across the country because remember it was right after September 11th, so I wasn't going too far. But I took a train from New Jersey to LA, but through Canada. It was a glorious trip, nice. But then I flew to Hawaii and spent some time there. And while I was there, I was reading a story about a guy who worked at the Pitel-Killah Tower on Waikiki Beach, mm-hmm. which was just close to where my youth hostel was, and it had been shut down. There was lots of stories about this building that had been shut down because it was a huge mold issue, and it was big news on that little island. Yeah. And initially they thought it was a $500,000 problem, and then it became a $5 million problem, and then ultimately a $55 million problem. Wow. And so, but many people got sick from the building, or at least were claiming to have gotten sick by the building. And this is 2002. So this is 20 years ago, almost to, within months. In fact, it was November of 2001 mm-hmm. that this happened. So just about 6 months ago. And this one guy though, he had a story that just it was like a deja vu moment. And he had at 40 years old developed adult onset asthma, something I had never even heard of, and allergies and sensitivities to all sorts of foods that he had never had a problem with, in fact, that he loved and that were a normal part of his life.
Yeah.
And so he blamed exposure to the mold. And I thought, well, geez, that sounds a lot like my story, kind of in reverse. I wonder if we had a mold problem. So I called my father from a payphone, which probably isn't there anymore. I mean,
and they remove all the, I feel like those are gone.
Right? I think they're coming back though. Now they're like Wi-Fi charging stations.
Yeah, exactly.
Or Wi-Fi and like cell phone charging stations. But I called him and said, hey, do you think we had a mold problem at Old Trenton Road? And he just laughed at me. He's like, of course we did. We had mushrooms in the basement. Why do you ask? And I thought, man, like in that moment, for some reason, I was already at the point where I was like, mold is not good. This is not good. Why is this growing indoors? Like this has got to be something that makes you sick. But I didn't realize how ubiquitous this is, and also how we have generational ignorance about this subject. We're still working off of failed wives' tales and flawed beliefs that don't make any sense. And so the bottom line is, I ended up immediately realizing that this is where I wanted to spend my time and energy, because I realized that I became fascinated with how buildings impact people's health, specifically how we get sick from the buildings that we live and work in. And so it was with that curiosity that I came back to New Jersey, armed with a little bit of capital and like I said, a lot of interest. And took a job working for a mold remediation company, where I realized that they were doing a lot more harm than good, and there were no such things as independent inspection companies. And so that began a journey of learning about buildings by just jumping into it. I had no business being in this business. I had no training at all. I just went from the ground up, and I worked at a remediation contractor, seeing how these things work and how they don't work. And then digging into all the literature, which was scattered all over the internet, but it was not in one place. There was no training, certifications. This is literally 2 decades ago, and mold is just now becoming a top of mind subject for many people. And so that inspection company we pioneered the use of mold sniffing dogs, which got us a lot of national press, which you mentioned during my intro. And that became 1-800-GOT-MOLD. And then we also, because of the nature of those inspections being expensive for most people, and actually being cost prohibitive for most people, we decided to create a do-it-yourself product that would be sort of for every man, something that my parents could afford, which is the struggle that I had. My mold inspection company was out of reach for most people, especially renters or people on a single family income or single income. And so the GOT-MOLD test kit, which is available at gotmold.com, is really the answer to that. So anyway, you asked for the story and I gave it to you in sort of like one big breath. But
that was perfect though.
But that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
I love it. And so, I mean, I think that's so great that you got to a point where you realized that there was a necessity, there was a need for something that made it more accessible. Because a lot of times that doesn't happen. And then, some of those people get left out in the dust. They can't get to the bottom of what's happening. And mold has hundreds and hundreds of symptoms, right? I feel like when you come up to somebody that has been exposed to mold and they've tried all these different things, and, maybe they have a diagnosis, maybe they have some other issues, but, they really can't pinpoint it because they're not looking in the right direction, because their symptoms are so vast, right?
That's right.
And so I want to dive more into, you had mentioned some myths, right? Those wives' tales, some misconceptions. And I think that's a huge part of, there's some misunderstandings that people really don't comprehend. And I think that's really an important thing to share.
Sure. I mean, the myths are very, I mean, we could literally do multiple episodes on this because the myths are the fundamental problem with why mold is such a pervasive issue. See, I mean, we've been living on a water planet in buildings for a long time.
Yeah.
And mold is a function of nature. It's not something that happens like lightning striking, or, I mean, not that that's not nature, but it's not random, and it's in the way it behaves. It is the simple, predictable byproduct of something getting wet and staying wet for any length of time. Excuse me. And so, I mean, it's so predictable that the EPA has guidance around it. They say if something porous and absorptive gets wet and stays wet for 24 to 48 hours, it is likely moldy. And the industry standard, which for your guests is the IICRCS, as in Sam 520, as in standard 520. Okay. Which is a document you have to buy, which we're working on, by the way. We're working on making that public to the consumer so that they know what's supposed to be done when they hire a professional. Right now, it's murky because it's behind a paywall, and the contractors are allowed to sort of run roughshod because no one knows the rules. Right. Which is one of my prime directives, is overcoming that lack of transparency. But because that will by itself demystify many of these things, or demythify, if you will. Yeah. So the primary one I would say is that mold is this aberration, and that's a major misconception, or that mold is somehow nefarious. That's the other thing. Mold is literally nature's recycler. If it wasn't doing what it does outside, we'd have piles of dead stuff, trees, and I mean that's why we have coal and oil, is because there was a time when we didn't have fungi to digest those things, and that's why we have those deposits. Everything would pile up outside. It would be a very unpleasant way to live. So it's doing its job when it's doing it outside, but not when it's doing it in your living room, or in your basement. But mold, keep in mind, is just the byproduct. It's the beginning of decay. And so we don't want things decaying in our house unless it's under controlled circumstances, like fermentation in your refrigerator, right? Yeah. And so just knowing that it's the beginning of decay is a great way to understand how it starts to impact our bodies, because our bodies viscerally we're repulsed by decay. Whether it be feces or even, digestive byproducts, like, whether it be effluents or whether it be vomit, all these things are, we can't even help ourselves but turn away from these. And so our body will shut down and develop all sorts of self-protection mechanisms, including inflammation, the closing down of respiratory passages, and lots of different things to let you know you need to leave. You need to either fix this or leave. Right? It's very simple. The message is clear.
It is.
Right. So the big myth is that this is some sort of aberration. That's one. The other one is that you have to kill it. There is no need whatsoever, underscore bold-faced, to kill mold, ever, okay, unless you have a compromised immune system, and you're at risk of fungal infections, which is a big difference than having mold exposure. Fungal infections, where mold is actually growing, or fungi is growing in or on you, is a serious issue, and it only happens to people that have, generally speaking, with a compromised immune system, and it's a very, very serious thing and needs to be taken very, very seriously. And if you fall into that category, then you need to be even more vigilant about mold exposure. But by and large, the most important thing about this is that chemicals need not be used during mold remediation. This is written in the standard. It's also written in some of the other guidance, but try to find a contractor that doesn't want to use a biocide. And it's like trying to find a barber that doesn't have a pair of scissors. It's a fundamental tool in their toolbox, even though it doesn't belong in their toolbox, unless there's concern about like I said, an immune compromised individual, or sewage as part of it, like dirty water, essentially being the source of moisture, at which point sanitizing is obviously necessary for bacteria, right? So there is no need to kill mold. It doesn't make it easier to remove. It doesn't make it doesn't, in fact, there's good evidence that shows that spraying antimicrobials on molds that produce toxins, which is a very small number of them, by the way, contrary to popular opinion, actually it potentially causes enough of a threat that they can produce more mycotoxins.
Oh my gosh.
So how do you like that for unintended consequences? Not only that, many of these are water-based, and many contractors use them in lieu of cleaning, not as a precursor to cleaning. And so many times they're leaving behind dead mold, leaving water on top, moisture with dead mold, Mold loves to eat dead mold. So you're leaving food behind for the next, that's something called competitive release, where the strongest ones stay back and they eat the spoils. And so you got the big, strong, tough ones, and you've just left food and water. You might as well, give them put a pillow on their, put a chocolate mint on their mattress, on their pillow for them, and fluff their bedding for them, because they're gonna make themselves very comfortable there. So the idea of biocides is really it's a shortcut that becomes a long cut, as many do, and so there's no need to kill mold. Period. End of story. So that means no fogging. That means no zappers, no hydroxyls, no ozone, no essential oils. These are not effective remediation methods. They're effective at masking components of what mold produces, like odors and sometimes. Anyway, there is mold remediation is remove the building materials that can't be cleaned. Cut and remove the affected stuff, clean everything else, scrub the air, test before and after. And when you've gotten it to a normal condition, then you can. And of course, the most important part is fixing the water problem. Right. That needs to precede and precede all that work, and then also it needs to be confirmed again before the project is considered to be clear. So it's really pretty simple. It's just hard work. And guess what? Most contractors, they want the paycheck. They don't want to do the work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Sorry. Yeah.
No. Go ahead.
I want to talk about mycotoxins too.
Yes, please.
Do you have some? Yeah. It's did you have a question though before we proceed?
No. Mine can wait.
So I'm on my soapbox, so thank you for.
Like no, hang on, but 5 minutes, we'll pull that back out.
So mycotoxins, this is probably the most disconcerting of all of these myths, because it also makes its way all the way through to the healthcare practitioners. Yep. People love to think that they need to worry about toxic mold or black mold exclusively. So people, I've done, I don't even know how many mold tests in my career. Who knows how many? I should figure out what that number is one day.
I feel like you should.
I
feel like that would be valid. Yes.
Yeah, I should keep a counter, because now with the
counter. Yeah.
And one of the things that I've seen consistently is that there's no correlation between the types of mold in your house and the kind of disease you have. Mycotoxins are very real. They do make people sick. They are a source of illness in humans and animals. In fact, most of what we know about mycotoxins comes from veterinary research, by the way. And so we know very little about it in humans, because it's just not what we do. But the point is that that the hyper focus on toxic mold and black mold is a misnomer. First of all, toxic mold. Black mold. The black mold that we're worried about is called Stachybotrys, generally speaking, and it's not even black. It's a dark green. And it produces toxins, but it only produces them sometimes, usually when it's under threat, either for competitive reasons. In other words, there's too many other molds there. That it will release these toxins to kill the other molds. This is how antibiotics were discovered. Antibiotics, by the way, are mycotoxins. So is it any coincidence that sometimes when we have these treatments for things like Lyme disease, that we end up with mold sensitivity?
Right.
See? Right? People don't think antibiotics are mycotoxins. Not all of them, but most of them are mycotoxins. And you're taking them in concentrated pill form while you're susceptible. And oftentimes, many times while you have a leaky gut, and many times when you got other issues going on. And, there isn't any coincidence that these things overlap. But the hyper focus on the mycotoxin based or the mycotoxigenic molds is to assume that exposure to the other molds is harmless, or that if that mold isn't growing in your house, that there's no action to be taken. And this there's nothing that could be further from the truth. Mold is not the issue. And if mold isn't the issue, then mycotoxins aren't the issue. See, mold is not the issue. It's dampness that's the issue, because at the root of all decay in a building, at the root of all unhealthy buildings, with the exception of just pure on chemical issues, because they've just used toxic stuff to build the house, at the root of almost every sick building is moisture issues. And it's not just mold. Of course, mold is the first thing that shows up to the party, but it's also dust mites and book light. There's an entire ecosystem. You'll see in damp houses spiders. Well, guess what? They're eating. And you get the little four-legged critters that come in. You get the and so there's an entire. It's almost like that old Mother Hubbard nursery rhyme where it's just each thing eats the next, but it all starts with a little bit of dampness. And so by thinking that we need to focus on toxigenic molds, also lots of doctors, anyone who's doing mold work out there is focused on mycotoxin testing. And if people don't have mycotoxins in their blood or urine, it is as if that would be the only measure of exposure. It's really, you're missing the vast majority of mold sickness does not come from mycotoxins. It's coming from the musty odor. It's not coming from the spores either, by the way. This is the other thing, because the spores are irritants, and they do carry some mycotoxins, but you're not going to see enough of them in most cases to cause anything other than acute respiratory, dermal stuff, allergic reactions, inflammation based stuff, in my experience. Now, keep in mind, I'm not a doctor, never even played one on TV, but I've only done thousands of these. And so what I'm sharing with you is my experience, and results may vary, mileage may vary, but the reality of it for me is very clear, that when moisture produces, when moisture and the right environmental conditions are present, mold will begin to grow. When it begins to grow, the first thing all molds do is produce, when they're eating, they're digesting, they're creating mold burps, or people like mold farts. These are digestive byproducts. If you're exposed to digestive byproducts of other creatures for very long, you may not feel well. It's very simple. You're on the exhaust end of decay, right? And it geometrically multiplying. If it takes 24 to 48 hours for it to grow, keep in mind that one spore becomes 1,000, 1,000 becomes 1,000,000, 1,000,000 becomes 100. It just continues, and it's just geometric. And while it's doing that, it's eating and digesting, and that effluence is continuing. And then we live in tight buildings because of energy efficiency, and we rebreathe that stuff constantly. And that also leads into why a lot of people have chemical sensitivities, because a lot of these chemicals that molds produce look a lot like industrial solvents when you look at them chemically. And so in terms of what makes people sick, and in terms of mycotoxins, I implore everybody who's listening to this, especially anyone who's practicing and helping people with mold-related illness, to widen your view from mycotoxins and realize that dampness and the byproducts of that are bad for your health. And that the chemicals associated with the musty odor, which are being researched now, are likely the underlying cause of most of the illness, especially the ones that don't show up with positive mycotoxin screens.
Makes sense. And so what about, I know that sometimes people will do some type of remediation. And again, it may not be right. So I'm going to put that out there now. But it's in their ductwork. Right? Like, let's say, and then it's obviously it's gone. Like, technically the source is gone, that's been fixed, but then it's in the ductwork. What do you do at that point? Or what are some of the concerns at that point?
Well, so
is that a misconception too? I don't know.
The key to a healthy house is clean and dry. That's the healthy home mantra, is clean and dry.
Yeah.
And so when most ductwork, with the exception of lined ductwork, insulated ductwork, any metal ductwork is going to accumulate dust. Generally speaking, you should not have mold growing in it, because there really isn't, except for household dust.
Yeah.
Duct cleaning should be done as a normal part of household hygiene. Just like you vacuum your floors, you should vacuum your ducts, right?
Yeah.
But that being said, during remediation, you should also have the HVAC system isolated. It's difficult if you're doing it in the winter. It's difficult if you're doing it in the blistering summer. But even so, you should isolate the HVAC system while you're doing any of that work, just to keep that. And then the ducts should be cleaned, before clearance testing, ideally.
Yeah.
But that doesn't always happen, because you're talking about lining up two different contractors, and they don't always play well together.
Yeah.
But yeah, ductwork is a major. It conveys good air and bad air. But at the same time, it is most cases that we see are the ductwork is a minor component, believe it or not. It was something that I looked at a lot. We used to drill lots of holes and sample all the time. And my experience has been, with the exception of flawed ductwork, where there's a building defect associated with the installation, where you've got either it's going down into a slab, which is a problem, or if it's going into unconditioned spaces like crawl spaces and attics that are not heated or cooled, that can cause problems.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they're not even ductwork; they're just cavities within the wall that are used. The air gets blown in. It's called panned out. It's just really hack stuff that you see in a lot of tract homes. Those can be problematic because you're blowing cold air and you can bring condensation in there, and they're usually sheetrock lined because it's wallboard. And so those things, but I'm talking about standard metal ductwork is not, generally speaking, a huge source of difficulty, but poorly done ductwork is a disaster.
Yeah. Okay. And so what do people like, what do you do after the water? Like, what's that first step? If someone finds water, what's the first step for them? I mean, they can obviously get a test kit, but what do they do?
Well, first thing you want to do is get some sort of testing. Rather, first thing you want to do is figure out how long that water problem has been there. And if you have any idea, the first thing you should do is if you know for sure that it's been less than 48 hours, then just remove the building materials that are wet. Look carefully for mold, and if you see any mold, stop removing stuff. You should always wear proper protective gear. Everyone's got an N95 mask these days, or at least most people do. And so that's a really good place to start. So just figuring out what your timeline is. If it's a sudden and accidental flood, you may call your insurance people, but you want to do that very gingerly because oftentimes the water damage claims can pile up on a claim. You can get dropped easily. So you got to be very careful about that. The most important thing is reducing personal exposure and not disturbing the mold. So you want to make sure that if it's been more than a few days, that you don't disturb it. That's the time when you might consider getting a professional involved if you've got the budget. But you in that case, you want to make sure that they're independent and that they specialize in mold. And that means that they're not a remediation contractor. Their brother isn't a remediation contractor. And that they don't do, roofing on the side, and that they're not just like a home inspector that happens to have an air sampling pump. Like, that is not what you need. You need somebody who actually knows how to navigate water damage according to standard, and then also how to navigate mold remediation according to standard. And that means that they've had IICRC training and that they're properly qualified. Usually they've also got an IAQA designation of some sort, like certified indoor environmentalist or something along those lines. Those are the kinds of, so you really want to look at IICRC as a screening, and you also want to look at IAQA, which is actually now ACAC.org. And that's where the trainings must go through. So you getting a professional is not always possible or practical. It's cost prohibitive for many people. And so in that case, we recommend that people consider doing something that's cost effective. And unfortunately, there's just not anything on the market that we could recommend. And so we had to create that, which is
which I think is amazing. I think that's fantastic. I'm going to order mine because I'm just like, I want to test my house.
We have to get you one.
I want to know what's happening. What's going on, right?
Yeah, no, that test kit, our test kit, the Gotmel test kit, uses spore traps, which are the same devices that you would use if you were a professional doing air sampling. As with all testing, whether it's COVID testing or any kind of testing, you can look at the organism in lots of different ways, right? So you can look at their metabolic byproducts. You can look at how they're interacting with other environmental issues. And so in this case, it's a straightforward. We're looking at spores in the air. Now, there are some cases where you might have mold in a wall, and so the VOCs are coming through, but the spores aren't. In those cases, we recommend a product made by a company called, they used to be Prism Analytical, now they're called Enthalpy Labs, and that's a VOC test kit called the Home Air Check, and homeaircheck.com. That's a great tool, a great test to pair with ours, because it can tell you if there might be mold sequestered in a wall that might not show up as high spore counts. And so, there's no test that's a silver bullet. What you don't want to do is start ripping stuff out. You don't want to start being a hero. What you want to do is stop the water first, assess whether or not this has been more than a few days, more than a couple of days, determine whether or not there is mold that's in the immediate vicinity, either with a professional or with a do-it-yourself test kit. And then based upon that, then you have to weigh your options. If you're a homeowner and you've got the budget and you can swing a professional, by all means, and if you can find one, great. The problem is there's just a real lack of them. It's a very, very difficult marketplace for the consumer. It's a major issue, but there are lots of resources. I mean, I will tell you that we put a welcome page on your website, on our website rather, for this podcast, where we and we'll put that in the show notes. I got to pull up my Slack. I believe it's gotmold.com / is it human optimizer?
Oh, human optimization, probably.
Human optimization. Yes. And so gotmold.com / human optimization. And I'll pull up Macarena sent this to me just before we got on. Okay, cool. And on that page, we posted a link to an ebook that we produced called How to Find Mold.
Fantastic.
This is a really good resource for anyone who's dealing with that very issue. As soon as you've got a concern and you're not quite sure, do I start making phone calls? Do I order one of these test kits? The best thing for you to do is read that little ebook. It's filled with checklists and FAQs and sensible, accessible language, as well as resources in the back for what to do next and different respectable, trustworthy online resources. And so I highly recommend people go there. So again, it's at gotmold.com / human optimization. Also there, you'll see that if you're interested in a test kit, we posted a coupon code there, which is optimization 10, which will give any of your listeners 10% off on any of our test kits. So,
perfect.
As a way to say thank you for listening.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that is such great information. I hope that everybody takes the opportunity to download that, read through it, do a checklist. Even if you don't think you have a problem, I think it's worthwhile doing regardless, right? I just think that it's good to know because again, mold can cause hundreds of symptoms. And I do really want to continue. I want this to be like a continual, right? Because we need to have like a second one because there's a whole aspect of the connection. Like you talked about Lyme, you talked about gut health. And I want to get into all of that because I really believe that people maybe don't even understand how many symptoms can be related with mold and how many conditions and issues can be from that particular exposure with regards to what you talked about, that musty smell and what have you. So I think that's a whole other podcast. And I definitely want to make sure that we do that in the very near future.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. That's a big conversation. We all live in buildings, we all breathe air.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think if you haven't dealt with a mold problem yet, you will. And so this is very practical knowledge. And we have this habit as humans to be very farsighted. We tend to worry about the things that actually have low impact on us. And we tend to, like if you think about the 4 basic human needs, air, water, food, shelter, we can get without shelter for a while, but not that long, right? Depending upon the climate you live in. Food, you can go a long time. You can go a long time without food, but we obsess about food, and it is a major source of illness. But we obsess about food, and we should. It's super important. Water, man, you only got a few days, and you better obsess about water because quality of water is a big deal. But you've only got a few days without that. Air, which we think very little about unless it's too smelly or a taste, but you only have a few minutes.
Exactly.
And so, and the law of familiarity says that anything you're exposed to long enough, you'll take for granted. And I can't think of anything you're exposed to more than air, and that we take more for granted. And so, this is my mission is to make people see the non-visible, recognize what COVID has given us, which is the opportunity to recognize that you can have an unseen threat in your air, and that hygiene in general, taking care of your air will take care of you.
Exactly. Perfect. It's almost like your tagline. We just finished. It's like, that's the perfect tagline.
I'm going to write that one down.
Right? You need to write that one down because that was really good. Jason, that was fantastic. Thank you for coming and sharing your mission. And you can obviously see you're super passionate about what you do. And that's what makes you so successful and helping people, obviously. So thanks everyone for joining us for another episode of the Human Optimization Podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to my channel. There's a brand new episode every 2 weeks. Give us a thumbs up. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast host, make sure you give this episode a like, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to today's show. Head over to Pitel-Killah.com to gain access to some amazing free resources that will help you gain energy, erase debilitating symptoms, and be the best version of you. Remember to give this podcast a like and follow me on social media at Lisa Pitel-Killah. I'm here every 2 weeks with a brand new episode of the Human Optimization Podcast. Until next time.